Hi, I'm Lisa Dunn. I'm a STEM research librarian and the head of Special Collections and Archives at the Colorado School of Mines Library. In this presentation, we'll cover what is an oral history, what makes an effective oral history, and how we go about this process. Before I go further, let me define some important terms. The narrator is the person or persons who are telling their story. The facilitator is the person who helps the narrator tell their story, and the audience are those who experience the narrator's recorded story. This presentation is for both facilitators and narrators. The information about the facilitator's role will help the narrators understand this process. Note, you may choose to do your own oral history solo or with a colleague other than a project facilitator. The following information applies to yourself and/or your colleague as facilitators of your own do-it-yourself oral histories. Please also see how to record an oral history for technical requirements. So what is an oral history? It's a recording, but it's about a person telling their story with their own voice. It's about amplifying those voices that may not be fully represented in history, and it's primary source material, a first-hand account, which makes it foundational to understanding that history. And finally, an oral history is accessible and discoverable. An oral history is not perfect. That is its power, the power of the first-person account, the power of someone telling their story. An oral history has a goal to inform the audience and hopefully to engage and inspire that audience. So that's what an oral history is. Let me tell you what an oral history is not. An oral history is not an interview. It's not a question and answer session. It's not a conversation. The facilitator doesn't take as much of an active role in this process. If there are two narrators, however, both need to be aware that they're sharing experiences but also being recorded for an audience. So the subjects of their experiences need to be accessible to the audience. Traditionally, though, it's a facilitator who helps the narrator tell their story. An oral history is not rehearsed. It's not a script, and it's definitely not a presentation like this PowerPoint presentation. And an oral history is not focused on other people. The focus is on the narrator and their story. An oral history project is built around a theme and participants usually. It may be the story of my hometown or a story of women at mines. It's centered around sharing these stories, and it's founded on preserving those stories. Oral histories can be in-person or virtual. Our project is going to be virtual, so we will do remote recordings. So the project steps begin with identifying participants who are interested in telling their stories or facilitating. Then there's training for facilitators primarily, although it helps if the narrators understand what the facilitators are doing, and agreements between the project and the narrator on their content, the actual production of the oral history, that's the product, making the recording discoverable and accessible, that will be the library's role, outreach on the project, and preservation, and this will also be the library's role and ultimately the responsibility of the university. Our tools for the project are a list of suggested resources, and these are available on the library's webpage of Oral Histories at Mines, a checklist for facilitators, permission forms for the narrator, a recording checklist on staging and using Zoom for this process, sharing the feedback so that we can improve our process and make it a better process for everyone, and intake for the recording files to the archivist. So, what makes a good oral history? First of all, facilitators. They're the ones who build a rapport with the narrator, and I'm going to mention this more than once. It's about being engaged in the narrative, but in a neutral way, and respecting the narrator's concerns. For example, the narrator might be nervous, may have concerns about a subject, and so forth. It's about being prepared. I hate to say this, but there is homework in facilitating a narrative. So facilitators practice your skills in working with the narrator. You can practice on friends or family. I highly recommend this, though. Practicing was where I was able to identify my problem areas. For example, I struggle with silences, and I try to fill them. That's I want to do it. And I also use a lot of verbal cues like oh and ah or ha. And those aren't the sorts of things you want to hear in a recorded history. And listening and observing as part of this process. For the narrators, there's an aspect of being prepared as well, and I'll go over that as we go along. So the process. First, contact. Project member or facilitator will identify and contact potential narrators. And I'm going to refer to project personnel as facilitators at this point forward, because some of them will be facilitators, and that's just the best way to refer to them. Again, start building that rapport and provide information about the project and answer questions. Explain what the recordings will be used for. Ask for a resume or a biographical sketch or other materials the narrator would like to include as context for their narrative. And preparation is key. Facilitators will review the narrator's biographical information and do some practice, and narrators will think about 1 or 2 topics that they want to cover. So the planning meeting is where the facilitator and narrator meet, either virtually or in person. The facilitator will continue to build that rapport, because this is the time for you guys to have that conversation, to reminisce, to ooh and ah, be natural, and just kind of get some idea of what you want to talk about. And start the conversation on the scope of the narrative. What would the narrator like to cover? Narrative topics. First of all, ideally both the facilitator and narrator will take notes on the topics that are going to be discussed. Talk things through. What topics to cover in what order. It's a good idea to construct an outline, although not a script, just an outline of what you're going to talk about. Discuss the time allotted to these topics. We're aiming for about 10 to 30 minutes for the session, so maybe 1 to 2 topics at a time. It is very important that discussing timing be done to keep the narrative on track. For example, you both might agree that the topic of choosing to attend Minds is worth 10 minutes. Your dream to be an engineer is worth 20 minutes. That 10 to 30 minute time frame is a guideline, though. If you want to cover additional topics, we recommend that you schedule another narrative. It's as easy as that. There isn't a right or wrong answer for what your narrative is, and there's no problem with a little under or a little over that time. So the planning meeting includes a brief on our mutual responsibilities and on consent. It is critical that the narrator understand the process and the outcomes, and that the project be able to use the narratives. The facilitator will clearly communicate to review the steps of the oral history process with the narrator. The product will be a video or audio recording of the oral history, a written transcript of the oral history, and any biographical documents submitted as context for the oral history. Its intended use is to make this content publicly available. So for the Women of Minds project responsibilities, our responsibility is generally to preserve the voice of women at Minds and make those voices accessible and discoverable in a respectful process. The intended use of the recording specifically is that we plan to make this information publicly available. So that's important to remember. And that availability includes access on the web. Once made openly available on the web, we cannot take this back. If someone wants to copy it while it's up there, there's nothing we can do about it. So that's important to just understand that. What the narrator controls is that they get a copy of the recording and the transcript. They will have a designated opportunity to withdraw from the project if they don't like what they said, or if they they don't even need a reason. They can just withdraw. They can ask for an edited version of the written transcript to be made available instead of the original version. There are documents to be signed. The narrator will sign those documents for intellectual property rights and usage, which is basically that the narrator will generally keep the copyright, but will give the Colorado School of Mines Library a perpetual, non-exclusive rights to use this content and make it available. So I want to talk a little bit about comfort levels at the planning meeting, and I want to address subjectivity and bias. This is the opportunity to ask the narrator how they would like to incorporate subjects such as gender, race, cultural, or personal experiences into the narrative as relevant. This is also the time for the facilitator to reflect on any bias of their own that could affect that narrative. For example, one of the oral historians I work with had, as an atheist, a bias related to religious topics. She knew to watch her responses in those areas. She was self-aware. So off-limits or sensitive topics, this is where the facilitator and narrator work together on how or if to approach those topics. It's as easy as that. The planning meeting is also about determining the flow of the narrative. The facilitator's role is to be there to help the narrator tell their story and to try to maintain a balance between formal and friendly. So ask the narrator how they want to be prompted as to timing or moving on to the next topic, for example. The narrator's role is to avoid a rehearsed presentation. That reading out loud feel pushes an oral history towards a performance or a presentation like this one. This negatively impacts the oral history as an experience for the audience. But the thing is, don't stress about this. This process is meant to be informal, and remember that it's okay. It is okay to make mistakes. It is okay to feel a little stiff or uncomfortable. It is okay to forget things. It's all going to be okay. So the narrative itself, the session, again, about 10 to 30 minutes long, and you want to be able to take a break and stop the recording if you need to, although this shouldn't be much of an issue with a 10 to 30 minute presentation. If you want to tell additional stories, discuss in the planning meeting to schedule another session. And it depends on the topics the narrator is interested in and the time you both have on how far you want to go with this. So the narrator's process is, or the facilitator's process is to listen and have your notes available on and watch the topic and timing prompt on the topic that you've discussed with the narrator, and basically follow the narrator's lead. You guide the narrative as a facilitator, but you also follow the narrative thoughts, the narrator's thoughts. Prompt the narrator for meaning and context. If they mention something you don't understand, it's likely the audience will have trouble as well. So definitely ask follow-up questions to clarify. If the narrator veers off topic, that's actually okay. You can talk about in the planning meeting how you want to handle this. Sometimes an off-topic oral history is just fine. So a little bit about subjectivity. You need to let the narrator tell their own story. The point of an oral history is its subjectivity. The facilitator is the neutral party in this. They can feel empathy, etc., but they don't add their voice to the narrative. The facilitator should use body language, since this is going to be a Zoom call, a body language to like nods and facial expressions to make sure that the narrator understands that you're paying attention. And other than that, you can mute yourself. When you're not speaking, it's just very easy to do that. And also to avoid sound cues like oh or uh-huh. Imagine how these would sound in the narrative and look on a transcript. So tough topics, just be respectful. You may have tough topics, you may not. It's okay to decide not to go further if you have some and they come up. Emotion is okay. The narrator and facilitator should discuss how to handle emotion at the planning meeting. For example, it's maybe a good idea to have a signal so that the facilitator can give you time to recover or even stop the recording, although we do try to avoid this. Excuse me. So as to the types of questions, after the staging statement, which the facilitator makes, they can kick off the narrative with a question to the narrator. This question will depend on the narrator's topic. It's a good idea to agree on that starting question. So here are just some examples of the types of questions the facilitator can ask the narrator. Exploratory or descriptive questions are often a good way to start. For example, why did you decide to come to Mines? You might want to pursue something like, did tenure change your perspective? Follow-up questions are important. Again, if the narrator is talking about something the facilitator doesn't understand or feels that may not be well understood outside of, like, for example, the Mines community, they can ask a follow-up question because they kind of represent the audience in this respect. For example, well, I know that summer field session, what summer field session is. Could you explain it for those who might not know? And also reflective questions. What do you think about the path your career has taken? And these questions can all be at least run through both narrator and facilitator. So a little bit about troubleshooting. Things happen. Okay, it's okay. For example, if the narrator can't remember details of an event in the past, just focus on what you can remember. So the facilitator doesn't understand the subject, again, use those follow-up questions to seek clarity for yourself and your audience. Silence. So silence is okay. Sometimes you need space to gather your thoughts, but silence can also be very powerful in underlining an emotional topic or a groundbreaking event. Off topic, yeah, keep an open mind on what's going on. Be respectful of time. You do want to make sure that you don't let this go on too long, but off topic, as I said before, can be just as interesting in its own way as the topic you as facilitator and narrator agreed on. So with all this information, remember, this is an adventure for all of us. You want to learn new things. You want to make your mistakes. It's okay. Give the project your feedback so we can improve it. Connect with your colleagues, and above all else, have fun with this. So that's my presentation on building a narrative for oral history. So if you have questions, we have links to supporting resources on oral histories at Minds, and those are at the bottom of the screen. We have Ask a Librarian for Get Help. So if you have something, what are you left wondering, or what do you need? And this could be something that you think of a week from now or longer. You can contact myself, Lisa Dunn, via Ask a Librarian at Get Help. So thank you for watching this presentation.